Hi there. My name is Maaike Rosendal. I have been working for CCBR since 2012, and I am one of the speakers. In addition to that, I'm married to Nick, who was on the call just before this one, and we've been blessed with 5 children.
And I'm Charmaine. I'm married to Jonathan Van Maren, and we have been blessed with 2 kids. And I work in projects, and I do a bunch of editing. I'm not usually in front of a camera ever, so this is new to me, but it'll be interesting. So
when we were thinking about what to do a live streaming about, or what we could focus on, our mind went to what we've been working on over the last few weeks. And so when the social distancing guidelines came into effect, when we were no longer able to do our public outreach and our presentations, we kind of started to brainstorm about what we could be doing instead. And so from our perspective, there was a lack and a need, especially when it came to resources for parents in the pro-life movement. So both being moms, our mind went to that, but also because after many of my presentations, I'm approached by parents who ask me the same question: how do I teach this to my kids?
Yeah, so something we realized at CCBR, and we've come to realize that this, talking to a lot of people over the years, is that if we as families don't root these values into our children, based on the culture that we know we live in 12 or so years from now, we can basically start over. And if our kids aren't pro-life, somebody is going to teach our kids something else. And so the idea was born to create a resource for parents to use in their home. So something that's simple, that's practical, it's not calling you to be out there on a stage or speaking in front of a huge audience. It's how do you raise your kids to be pro-life and to teach your children to value life from a young age, and then also to instruct them about the truth about abortion at an appropriate time or when the conversation comes up, however that looks like, so that you can foster that culture of life in your own home. So before we get into those details, we probably need to back up a bit and talk about why this is so important. I mentioned before that the culture we live in is a culture of death, but that's a phrase that not a lot of people know exactly what it means. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. I think it's safe to say for a lot of people watching that we know that the culture's position these days is not super friendly to pro-life. And I would go so far as to say that the culture by default is now pro-abortion and pro-death. And we need to fight that, because in a culture of death, society no longer protects all human beings equally.
Yeah, and so that's what we're doing at the beginning of our book that we're writing together now as a resource for parents, because I think it's good for us to first take inventory about our culture. We might think that our homes are pro-life, so that culture of death might be out there, but how does that impact our kids? And so the one that comes to mind, first of all, for me was my experiences going to university. And I realized very quickly when I was studying social work at the University of Lethbridge and in Calgary that I was the only pro-lifer in the entire faculty of social work. But it wasn't just your social work topics like psychology, sociology, much about self-determination, but it was kind of throughout all the subjects that we studied, whether it was history or ethics, or a lot of it had pro-choice ideology woven throughout it. And I don't think I'm alone in that experience. Jonathan mentioned at the beginning of the day when he started the live stream that when he went to university, he obviously considered himself pro-life because he came from a pro-life home, but that didn't necessarily mean that he knew how to defend that worldview or that he even knew what abortion was. And I think that's true for many young people who come from pro-life homes. They go to university and they're faced with a lot of pro-choice ideas and aren't necessarily prepared for that. Now, there are polls that back up those experiences as well. There's a Gallup poll that shows that the more educated someone is, the more likely they are to call themselves pro-choice. And that shouldn't surprise us because there's a lot of that coming through our public institutions of higher learning. And so we don't say that to discourage you from going to higher education or from sending your kids there. But I think it's really important for us to be aware of that and to prepare our children for that if they're going to such an environment.
Yeah, and this doesn't just start in university, although you'll see it very visibly when you're there. But I would say that many youth and teens even, and we'll get to kids in a minute, they're also constantly being bombarded with the culture that we have. And I'm just going to use the big social media as an example. Most youth and teens, to some extent, have a connection to social media and with that celebrity culture. And so when Mike and I were starting our book, we were kind of like, what's out there for youth? What's the messaging? So we just went online and we Googled the phrase celebrities and abortion rights. This was not limited to celebrities. I would say this covered a lot of influencers as well. And over 3 million links popped up outlining the support for the donations to, and of course, like the whole shout your abortion idea of being proud of your abortion testimony. And the theme that came back over and over and over was pregnancy termination is normal. And if you're against abortion, you're awful. And I'm just going to give you a bit of an example of someone a lot of us knew growing up, the name of at least the pop singer and actress Selena Gomez. And I'll cover just in a second why we're picking her, but most people recognize her name from her music and from the relatively child-friendly show she participated in early in her career. But when you go back to her now, one of her favorite accessories is a 1973 necklace, which, and I took this from an article, honors the historic Roe versus Wade decision. And the image linked to her Instagram post, and it read, "Stop telling women what to do with their bodies." And then a link for her followers to volunteer for or donate to the pro-choice cause. The reason we picked this example is because a lot of people are Christians, a lot of pro-lifers are Christians, but Selena Gomez also professes to be Christian. Her Instagram bio is her name, and then it reads, "By grace through faith." So she doesn't identify as a secular singer. She doesn't fight Christians, so to speak. She identifies as one, but as a Christian singer, she promotes abortion. And there's a lot of other social media influencers out there too who aren't necessarily celebrities, but they get featured on Instagram and then they become big, and then a brand approaches them, and before you know it, you're being bombarded with advertisements about this and that, things that they're really pushing and amping up, and their messaging is getting into your brain without you really noticing. I'm going to refer to Ireland probably once or twice in this because it's in my mind for some reason, but when we were in Ireland 2 years ago for the referendum, I remember I had followed on Instagram a girl who was she posted lots of pictures of herself in like old, beautiful Irish countryside themes with old-fashioned clothes. Like she seemed very, very innocent. But as the referendum approached, she started pushing more like pro-choice ideologies. And as it came closer and closer, she just straight out came out wearing one of the repeal sweatshirts that were very popular at the time. And I realized that probably for the last 2 or 3 months, I also had been consuming what she was saying about the culture and about life in Ireland. So we see that there's lots of people who were considered innocent in previous years who now openly advocate for abortion, and they target kids and they target youth and teenagers, and I would say kids younger and younger now have access to that. And kids don't realize that they're being targeted by advertisements. They're just there. But that messaging gets through to them. And I don't think kids and their parents are even realizing how influenced they are by this culture until it's almost too late.
But I think that's the point, that a lot of it is subtle, right? In that you might be absorbing all of these messages without thinking that you're looking at pro-choice stuff, a lot of it because of the language that's being used. So there's the influence at universities with pretty strong pro-choice ideology everywhere in the course load. There's social media, which people are on a lot. And then there's also our schools. So not just universities, but also just high school. And at CCBR, we don't think it's our place to tell you where to send your kids to school. But I think it's very important to realize that this environment that promotes abortion isn't just limited to universities and colleges. And we know that from doing public outreach outside of public schools, where young people tell us that girls who are 15 and already have had 2 abortions, where they've never even considered that there are other options because that's just the thing to do. Abortion is normal. It's like Charmaine said earlier, that if you're against abortion, that's what makes you different. And so if your kid is in that kind of a school environment, it will be very challenging to raise your kids pro-life. At the very least, you'd have to work extra hard to raise them with pro-life values. And there's certainly examples of teenagers who have come through that and still being pro-life, and who have made a difference in that environment. But a lot of the work we're doing as parents will be undone in that kind of an environment. So I think we should be very aware of that. Just one more reason why we should be raising our kids pro-life and working super hard in realizing what's really happening in our culture and how our kids are being influenced, and why we need to be engaged, actively engaged and intentional on the other side of this issue.
Yeah, so I have 2 kids and they're very young. I think the extent so far of our pro-life apologetics has been teaching our daughter that Auntie Nina has 2 babies here and here. And she understands that, but she doesn't understand much more than that. So how would you say that younger kids are influenced by this? And do you think they're as susceptible to this culture of death as well?
That's a good question. And I think a lot of parents might object to us saying that there's a culture of death around us and that our kids are influenced by that if their kids are still young. So my oldest is 9, and you might think that, you know what, they're not in that kind of environment. They only hear pro-life messaging at home. So how could they be influenced? And again, it's very subtle. And I realized that not too long ago when I'd gone to do groceries with one of my boys, and one of them said to me, why do people not like it when you have babies? And so I looked a little bit surprised at him and said, why do you think that? And he said, well, when you say you're pregnant, most people ask you, is it your last one? Or when you have a baby, they say, are you done now? So it's like babies are a bad thing. And I found that really interesting because that kind of language we hear a lot as parents when we go, even just doing something as simple as groceries, and our kids absorb that. So I'm not saying you should keep your kids inside your house so that they will never hear any of that. We just want to raise awareness about the fact that that does happen. And that's why we need to be in conversation with our kids. And that's why we need to be teaching them intentionally about pro-life values, because they will get the other side, even just going grocery shopping with mom.
Yeah. And it's easy to blame the culture on all of these things and talk about the culture as if we're not part of it. But I think it's easy for these ideas to creep in just without us even noticing. I don't think I've ever said this story out loud before, but I remember driving to school with my best friend, Amy, and I couldn't drive yet, so I must have been 15. And she asked me, she's like, what do you think about the pro-life, pro-choice thing? And to me, they weren't opposites. I was like, oh yeah, I'm pro-choice. And she's like, Charmaine, she's like, that's killing a baby. And I was like, oh, I never really thought about that as being the opposite. Like I knew what pro-life meant, but I never thought about pro-choice because to me, pro-choice sounded like a good word. And we like choices. And that's another reference to Ireland. I was thinking earlier that a lot of the advertising there was about care and compassion and choice. And who doesn't like the idea of those things, right? So if you don't know what pro-choice means, if pro-choice means that we're okay with people killing their children or forcing abortion on other people, then pro-choice sounds like a good word, but our kids need to know what pro-choice means. And I think it's safe to say that pro-choice actually means being pro-abortion or even pro-death.
Yeah, so I think, Charmaine, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that story shows that pro-life families need to be really intentional, not just in being pro-life, as in a belief we have, and we're kind of assuming that our children will download that belief, but actually teaching what that means and incorporating it right into our daily life, like not just thinking we're a pro-life family, so our kids are going to be pro-life too, but teaching them. And not only what pro-life is, but also what abortion is, right? Because in your situation, you didn't even realize what that meant.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So for the moms and the dads watching, maybe think, okay, I get it. We have to be intentional about it. It's our responsibility to do that. But what does that look like? Where do we start? Well, one of the things that we're starting our book with is something that you probably have heard a lot of times. People say the most pro-life thing you can do is to raise your children. Now, we agree with that, but we want to add something to it. We say the most pro-life thing you can do is to raise your children pro-life. So not just to assume that they're going to be pro-life, but to be intentional about that. Now, we're not going to give away all the things that are in the book because we want you to buy it in the fall. But there are 2 resources that we want to pass on to you now, for those of you watching right now or perhaps later. So last year, I wrote an article about raising our children pro-life, and that link's being thrown up right now. There's some practical examples in that. It explains the rationale behind it, just really simple things that we can incorporate into our day-to-day lives. Something as simple as, when we're talking about our kids needing new shoes because their feet have grown, and if you have, oh, my screen just turned off. There we go. And if you have one of those little baby feet pins, then you can point that out to your kid that your feet were that little when you were 10 weeks old in mom's tummy. So read that article for the parents out there. Feel free to share it. But then Charmaine also has something to point out or to share with you guys, a really great resource.
Yeah, so I think the link or the picture is going to go up here. Yes, there it is. There is this really excellent book by Bethany Bomberger. It's written in rhyme format. It's really great. I wish I could read you a bit of it, but that's not the time for this. We've got it for purchase on our website. This is a great way to support CCBR and to start with your kids. Very age appropriate, and talks about how God created us unique and how he knit us together in our mother's womb. And it's just a really great resource to start with your children, reading it from when I read it with my daughter already, so from when they're very small already. And it gives them that foundation. And it's also a really great way to support the pro-life movement. And if you purchase that today, all proceeds are going to CCBR, and that also will help us fundraise.
Yeah, so 2 resources for you there already for now. So to encourage you, we point out in the book, but we also want to tell you that right now, that kids are inherently pro-life. So we have a really strong foundation that we can start from. And we know that parents have to teach their kids that abortion is okay if they want their kids to be pro-choice. But we can use the natural instincts that our children have been given. They see little babies and they know that babies are to be nurtured. My kids found a baby robin and wanted to take care of it. That's inside of them, and we can nurture that and we can build from that. You have a story about that, about Charlotte, right?
Yeah, Jonathan's written about this before too. When Charlotte was, I think, just under 2, because our son wasn't born yet, we came to the office for lunch and we're chatting over coffee, and she had found this bin we have of fetal models, and she was just had opened it up and she was like collecting all the little babies into her arms and rocking them back and forth and back and forth. And we came into the room and she just holds one up and she's like, baby, baby. And so she sits back down on the step and she insists that Jonathan sits down beside her. And he also was then instructed that he also needed to rock these babies back and forth, back and forth. And I think the beautiful part about that is that we never taught her that fetal models were babies. That was just something she just looked at them and she recognized, like, this is a little baby. And we didn't teach her to rock a baby either. And she certainly wouldn't have seen us rock a baby because she was the baby. It was just something she knew. It was instinctively in her. And that's a bit of a hint at our upcoming resource, is that don't be discouraged by like, oh no, I have to start now. Your kids are inherently pro-life. That's something that's ingrained into them by God. And you just have to build on it. You got to root that in. You got to reinforce it. But you're not starting from scratch. Their nature has it in them, and they know what to do with a little baby.
Yeah, so I have a story to end our section with, I think, but maybe I'll answer a question first from Maria, who asks, when do you think it is appropriate to show abortion victim photography to young people or to kids, I'm assuming? So I think that also depends on your child, and we know our own children best. We do know from our work on the street, where we can't always avoid children seeing the pictures of abortion victims, that the response of the parent very much dictates the response of the child. And so when parents freak out and start swearing and are very upset at the people showing it, kids have started crying and kind of panicking because the adult in their life who's supposed to know what to do is losing it. So that's obviously something to keep in mind. But I think that when kids see pictures of abortion victims and they are upset about that, they cry, they might be sad about it, they might have questions about it, that's a very appropriate response. And I've actually looked at my own kids having that kind of response and learned from that and thought they are responding the way all of us should be responding when we see those images. And what's super important for kids when they see these pictures is that we reassure them. So we can't just show them these pictures because we need to teach them about abortion, but we need to reassure them that they are safe, that we love them, that this will never happen to them or their siblings if they have them, and also that we are doing everything we can to stop it. Because that's the most distressing part to children, when they find out about abortion and they don't know about anything being done to stop it. But if we're saying, no, this is going on, but we're doing everything we can to bring an end to it, I have found in my experience, and I know many other parents who have found the same, is that kids want to do something about it. So we can involve them, we can tell them what we're doing, we can leave that up to them. When we read the book Pro-Life Kids with our kids, one of them immediately wanted to order a Pro-Life Kids t-shirt and start collecting money for pregnancy resource centers. So great, that's an awesome way to do something about it, so to take action. And tying into that, I'm thinking of an article I wrote a few years ago, but it was about an evening when I was just doing dishes in the kitchen, and I heard one of my kids coming out of bed and just kind of thinking, oh no, all the parents can relate when you think your kids are finally in bed. And it was one of our sons who came down the stairs, and he couldn't sleep, and he had a question. And when I listened to him, when I said, what's your question? He said, is it almost done? Or is it almost done? And I said, what is almost done? What are you talking about? And he said, abortion. Is abortion almost done? And it just even breaks my heart to think of it now. But I remember just crawling into bed with him and praying with him and saying, we don't know when, but we do know that if all of us are doing everything we can, then one day it will be done. And I think that when we talk to our kids, when we give them a safe environment at home where they are loved, where they learn about life, where they know that even if they make mistakes or whatever happens in their life, they can come back to us and we're there for them, and we're there for their friends if they face issues, but also where we teach them about abortion, that they need to know that we are doing everything we can. Because I think the most terrifying thing in teaching our kids about abortion is, what if they look at me one day and say, Mom, why didn't you do anything? And I think that's what they need to know from us, that we're doing what we can. So here's just our little segment about raising our kids pro-life. And we hope that, you're going to buy the book in the fall when it comes out. But also that if you can, that you donate today so that we can do this kind of work. We can write this book for you guys, and so that we can help other parents again, because not everyone needs to do the kind of work we're doing, but everyone needs to do something actively pro-life.